Nau mai, haere mai, ki tēnei hui. Welcome. And welcome especially to our guest, to John from Sense Partners. Welcome, nice to see you. And basically, I think I'm just throwing straight to Baz.
Good afternoon, everyone. I think the presentation has already been circulated to you. Is that correct? Can I just check on that? Yes, no? All right, very good. We will go through it in steps, and what I suggest is that there's a couple of different chapters to the presentation, so I suggest we have questions after each chapter. That's probably the most logical thing to do.
Okay, you'll just tell us when.
I will indeed. So
Okay.
LTP, another LTP workshop. These will be coming thick and fast over the next couple of months. As you well know, the LTP is made up of 101 different things, strategies, policies, KPIs, outcomes, priorities. And today's session is about significant forecasting assumptions, and it's a crucial foundation bit of the LTP. It doesn't get a lot of attention and a lot of notice often, but actually it's a core foundational element to any LTP. And that's what today's session is about, dealing with that future uncertainty. So today we're going to focus on population growth, and that's why I have Marcus Downs from the research team here, as well as John Stevenson from Sense Partners. Now, Sense Partners, they are demographers. They are demographers for the entire region, and so that's why John's here. If there's any technical, detailed questions, he's here to be able to answer those. From there, we'll go into financial assumptions, and I think, Andrea, you're going to take care of those. Climate change, Alison's there for that, and then we'll go through Three Water Reform and Let's Get Wellington Moving assumptions, and Siobhan and Andrea will take care of those. So just very, very quickly, what are assumptions? In essence, the areas of future uncertainty that we need to make some assumptions about in terms of the long-term plan. They are a legislative requirement, and they're a strong or a key focus for our auditors as well. And they must be reasonable, they must be supportable, so there needs to be an evidential basis for the assumptions that we make. As part of making the assumptions, we also need to identify the level of uncertainty that comes with the assumption, and therefore what kind of risk we're carrying with those assumptions. Additionally, the assumptions need to be consistent with each other. They need to be applied consistently, and like I said before, they need to have a supportable basis, so they need some sort of evidential basis to them. It is a point in time, so things do change. So, we have assumptions around inflation and interest rates. These things do change over time, as do population forecasts and so on and so forth. So we have working assumptions at this point in time. Today, we want to talk you through some of the big ones that we are using to underpin the LTP. We will keep a watching brief on all of this, and if new data or more information comes to light, of course, the assumptions can change over time. So I'll leave it there. I'll hand over the talking stick to Marcus, and then I think we'll go through the population data, and after that we can stop for questions before we move into the financial section.
Thanks, Baz. Kia ora koutou. As Baz said, I'm Marcus from the Research and Evaluation team. So, run through some of our population growth assumptions for the LTP. First up, I guess as a broad overview of where they're sitting at the moment. So we're expecting growth of between 50 to 80,000 over the next 30 years in Wellington City. This level of growth is similar to what we've seen over the past 30 years, but low by recent kind of pre-pandemic levels. We're expecting differential growth rates between the age groups, which equate to an ageing population, basically, and household growth is expected to be in line, with that population growth expectation. But the key kind of point of note there is that we're expecting the proportion of multi-person households to fall, while households that are alone, so single-person households, to increase. And as Baz said, the basis of these assumptions come from Sense Partners, who do the demographic forecasting for the whole region. It's a basically a big model, a 4-component model that takes into account birth, deaths, immigration, work and employment, households, and housing demand and supply. And the current forecasts we're working to are from early this year, based on data available at the end of January 2023. They're updated each year. So this is just that overall kind of growth story. So you can see that 50 to 80,000 growth range, where that sits across the kind of broader growth kind of horizon at the end of there. So you can see basically the median projection for Wellington City is to grow to 270,000 by 2054. And then our 50 to 80K range is kind of just a little bit below that median projection, up to around about the kind of 64th percentile, I think it is. Yeah. And then in terms of the age pyramid kind of breakdowns, you can see where we are now on the far left in the blue, and then kind of the middle being 2034, and then the end being 2054. And you can see how that proportion of 60 plus residents increasing from 16.7 to 19.7%, and the 20 to 39 decreasing from 36.7 to 32.5. Whereas the other two remain, the changes there are less kind of pronounced. And then the household stuff, as I just talked about, so that multi-person household proportion falling from 10% at the moment down to 8.9%, and the alone proportion increasing from just over 10 to just over 11%. Yeah, so obviously that's a reflection of the ageing population itself. And in terms of household growth, like across the city, so where it's household growth across the city. So we the projections give us household growth for each SA2 in the city, and so I've just kind of amalgamated those into the 5 wards, the 5 geographic wards, and you can see about a third of the growth that is occurring in the central ward, and then about, a quarter, I think it is, in the northern, and then kind of lower growth in the southern and eastern. And then this is that same data, but just at the SA2 level, so the individual blocks. And again, you can see that picture of the kind of darker blue areas more in the centre and the north, and then the kind of east and south being a bit lighter.
I was just writing a question down too, Ben, so yeah. But we'll keep going.
No worries. So in terms of level of certainty around there's figures that I've just kind of gone through. So similar to that 50 to 80K range is the same as what we had in the last LTP, and the level of certainty is, we're at the same level there. We called it moderate then, and we'll call it moderate now. In that, the kind of macro level assumptions that feed into those projections are largely the same. When you talk about I guess the attractiveness of NZ, from an immigration perspective, and all the other factors that feed into growing our city, they kind of are in a similar stage. But the one area where there is still a bit of more uncertainty than there has been in the past is around migration, and how that's going to kind of land after post-COVID. So you can see the graph on this slide is kind of talking about all those scenarios there. So it's projecting positive net migration out into that 2054 year, but you can see it kind of declining slowly. But that kind of broad, the kind of the different scenarios kind of mean that it could be higher or lower than that kind of thing. What have we got? And so, population projections in the LTP, so how they're used. So we need to account for our population growth in all aspects of our planning. So these projections form the basis of assumptions for our population growth, and they have impacts on various different figures within the LTP itself, and other kind of plans and that have kind of been done prior, so district plan and asset management planning and Wellington Water kind of growth stuff. and that default range of the 50 to 80k is kind of where, in general, most of those things sit. Like that's the range they're using, but different use cases, might use different parts in that range depending on, I guess, the risk of kind of over or under accounting for growth. And then on the right there, we've got the kind of the risks of underestimating, overestimating growth. So basically, if we underestimate future growth, then we kind of have an infrastructure deficit. We don't invest enough for the future, which causes problems. In terms of, I guess, mitigations for that risk, we've got development contributions that help kind of meet some of that growth, but not all of it. And in terms of if we're overestimating future growth, then we're over-investing in the short term. But as long as growth continues, then we catch up to meet that level of growth we've kind of invested for. And then keeping in mind that the LTPs are redone every 3 years, and these growth numbers are redone every year. So there's, we're not talking about leaving it like this for 30 years. We're going to reassess this in 3 years' time. So, yeah. And that's the end of this section, yeah.
Great. Ben?
Yeah, I was just wondering what the process is. So if there was a change of government, given they want to greenfield the entire Huddy Valley and Granada to Petone, would that need to change forecasting in the LTP, or would you probably kick that into being a problem for the next 3 years, given that's still really early policy time?
So one of the things that we have to do with significant forecasting assumptions is talk about the level of certainty or uncertainty that we have with those kind of forecasts. And so one of the uncertainties that's coming up around the corner is the general election. So it depends on what and how detailed those statements from whoever is the successful government is, right? So if there's just opposition to the current approach to the way we're dealing with growth, and they haven't got a plan B that is in a lot of detail, then in essence all we've got is just greater uncertainty. So until there is a better plan B and we know what that kind of looks like, we can't really model it out. So what we'd have to do with our assumptions is just have that higher uncertainty, that higher risk.
Oh, no, I appreciate that, just because that would change the projections in Takapū Ward quite dramatically if it did come to pass.
Yep.
But thank you.
I had myself next, and it was a question I'm diving into the recesses of when we last had a workshop like this last term, and I seem to remember some discussion about how we have historically tended to underestimate population growth, particularly Stats New Zealand, and I'm wondering for a little refresher of that summary.
Yes, no problem. We did actually have some slides on that, but I'm probably not the best person to answer that. Is John, are you able to speak to that? We can put some slides up for you if you like.
Yeah, do you want to put
It's like I knew, but I didn't actually.
We thought we wouldn't, but we have got some slides.
changed, but they're just consistently conservative. If you go back and count up the forecast errors, which all forecasters have, the forecast errors in stats data for the last 20 years for New Zealand, with all the updates they've had over that period and the corrections they could have put in place, you've got 2 Hamilton cities worth of population that they hadn't projected was going to exist. So that's kind of the planning error that's occurred in New Zealand that's led to things like infrastructure deficits. And to my mind, that's because of the kind of inbuilt conservatism of stats position. In some sense, I would say that, but yeah. So then that's the background.
That's really useful, and I guess is there sort of part of that inbuilt conservatism because we don't want to kind of freak people out about immigration or whatever some of the kind of political kind of things that sit very deep behind that.
Because it pushes up against political positioning, and there was always a view that Immigration New Zealand used to have targets for the number of visas it's processing on a net basis, but those are administrative targets, but they were typically treated as, that's the kind of not too hot, not too cold kind of Goldilocks outcome for immigration. And they didn't want to depart from that because it was like a de facto policy position. And then in addition, when you get near an election and someone's a bit, cross about immigration, as happens on occasion, the last thing you want to do is be projecting large number of immigrants and sort of fueling that fire. So it sort of behooves them to stay away from that niggle. Yeah.
Yeah, and I see we've got a slide there now.
If you go to the next slide, so that's the one that shows where the 2017. This is sort of what precipitated the move to region-wide sense partners or independent projections. You can see the orange there, and that was the 2017 projections that they had. It's in shares of the New Zealand population, so we're controlling for the fact that we have different views on what the national population will be. In addition to that, they thought there would be a rapid decline in Wellington's share of New Zealand population, and it didn't really happen that way. There has been a consistent sort of slight decline in the share of Wellington Region's share of the national population, but nothing like what was there. So that precipitated the change. And then the next slide is the one where that summarises how the forecast errors have accumulated over time. And you can see sort of up into the, around the GFC time, they got closer to the number. But the accumulation over time, 354,000 people that are in the New Zealand population that have not been accounted for, not been planned for. Yep.
Thank you. That's very interesting for all of the amateur demographers in the room. Is there a question from online?
Yeah, there's a question from Councillor Brown online.
Okay, all right. I've got a list. Diane.
Thank you. Just first up, just the population demographics, age groups, is that sort of consistent with the rest of the country, or is Wellington an outlier in anything? Because we all know is that population's aging, so what I'm just trying to understand is is it slightly different here as opposed to other parts of New Zealand?
In general, no. So that structural trend's exactly the same. Wellington City itself is different insofar as it has quite a strong younger churn population. So it has less sticky population under the age of 30. That's part of that's being a tertiary centre, but a lot of people come here for work and they stay a few years and they're off on an OE or they do something else. That's more pronounced in Wellington than in most other places in the country.
And I just wonder whether, just from one of the assumptions, whether we could look at the population projections for the region. And the reason I say that is we got people, if we see ourselves as the engine house of the region and also the main entertainment event area, being conscious about how many people are in the region, and because we'll be expecting them to flow in and out. So I just wonder whether you could look at whether that might be a relevant assumption to think about going forward to support any investment that we want to do, knowing we've got extra people coming in even on a temporary basis. Is that?
Yeah, so the model that we're operating under is a regional model, is my understanding, and so we derive a city population from that regional model. Is that correct? So we do have a regional number that is in operation within the model.
Yeah, so that's stuff that we can rely on. And in terms, so when we're thinking about how many businesses know or how many people are coming into work in the city or need transport or access, that we will be taking that into consideration.
Yes, absolutely. We can have a reference to that effect.
Okay, and just one final comment, and I looked at your, there was a slide where you showed the different wards and the growth, and presumably this is something that we've used previously, and I'm just thinking, the east and the south are the lowest growth, but yet we want to invest quite a bit of money in there from a Let's Get Wellington Moving perspective in terms of light rail. So how's that helped us, guide us to date?
These are all like, there's no kind of assumptions around what effect Let's Get Wellington Moving will have, in those areas within these things. These are kind of like baseline projections. So
I just wondered why we would, if that's what we're seeing growth by ward, and it's the lowest areas for growth, why either is that incorporating what we envisaged through Let's Get Wellington Moving?
Well, it would be more about potential growth in those areas, I guess, with Let's Get Wellington Moving, right? So there's, just because those are growing at that level, if the potential for growth in those areas might be higher than say in the northern area, right? Because it can be.
So have you factored in that if with the Let's Get Wellington Moving, which has been in our plans for a few years now, has that been factored into these stats?
No,
Not yet, no. So that's one of the things that, so when demographers do their work, they work on, obviously they look at the data that is available, and they also come quite often to councils to work out what's in the pipeline in terms of infrastructure investment, district plan changes. They look at consents, what stage they're at. And then they'll also have a look at other plans that are on the horizon, if you like. But what they tend to use and operate to is the information that has a reasonable level of certainty. So they also work on assumptions, right? And so Sense Partners have worked and created the baseline data for the region and for the city that currently doesn't include those big infrastructure investments within the organisation itself. So Sean O'Dane, who many of you will know, they're already starting to look at what that infrastructure investment would do to these numbers and how they would shift and whether they would grow. So this is the baseline assumption. Like I said at the start, we start with some high-level baseline assumptions. When we get better and more information, we feed that into the system. And so we've got someone working on what that would look like with a Let's Get Wellington lens on it.
Yeah, I suppose that the baseline assumption was that it was 3 years ago that we would have Let's Get Wellington Moving, light rail or whatever through to Island Bay. So I'm just wanting to know, is that included already, or is that is still to be included?
Not in these baseline data numbers.
Right, thank you.
Yeah, I just want to be clear though, Council, that we have done the work and it's been inputted into the regional work as well, but this is a baseline setting. So from a district plan point of view, I've mentioned this to a number of councillors, you've effectively upzoned the city by almost 3 times. You'll now have to consider, when you do decide with Let's Get Wellington Moving, the MRT corridor in particular, that is all about attracting growth. So that will create additional growth and probably a requirement to do additional zoning in that area to accommodate the growth. But this is just baseline. Is that correct? Yeah, thanks.
Oh, upzoning, that is exciting. Right, Sarah.
Just on the data that we do know, which is what has happened, what's we always have a 0.6% off the rates for growth. What does that actually equate for roughly in terms of our population per year?
So our growth rate, and John can speak to this, is zero, what we're forecasting. So historically, if you go back over the last 20 years, I think the growth rate's been on average 1.2%. And what
per year.
Per year, and what we're forecasting, or what Sense Partners is forecasting, is 0.8%, is my understanding. Have we got?
Yeah, 0.4, sorry, for the up to 28, and then 0.9. It kind of goes 0.4 in the kind of next 10 years, and then it goes up to 0.9.
So you're forecasting a rate lower than what we've actually had for the last
past
few years.
Yes. Yep.
I guess I just want to ask again the question about Let's Get Welling Moving. This is not allowing for growth through the Let's Get Welling Moving infrastructure investment. Would that be correct?
It's not about not allowing for it. It's more that it's not.
Calculating it.
Well, yeah, because there's not enough information to kind of put that into the model yet. It's too uncertain to include basically at this point because that's about that could change the way that growth happens in the city, obviously. But it's it's based off the information we have now available to us.
Okay, but that's that 0.4% or whatever we decided it was, is the 30 to 80,000, is it?
There's three separate growth rates: 0.4% up to 28, and then 0.9% between 28 and 38, and then 0.8% between 38 and 48. So those amalgamated growth rates over that period is that 50 to 80, although that's not going out to the same time frame, that's out to 48,
So
not
a
54.
very small percentage increase on an annualised basis does add up to quite a substantial number of people over that period of time, and that's what people don't often realise. They look at that 50 to 80,000 number and they go, that seems very, very large, but the reality is that it's a small percentage annualised. And what that 50 to 80,000 is less than what we've had in the past, and that reflects the assumptions that we've made, but also a decreasing natural growth rate. So a lot of our population increase actually comes from inward migration from overseas and from the rest of the country as well. So if you look at the population makeup of Wellington, I think about a third of us are actually Wellingtonians, born and bred. About a third come from the rest of New Zealand, come here to work and to study and to live, and then another third, roughly, this is very rough, comes from overseas. And so, like you said, John, there is a reasonable amount of churn, being a student city and a capital city. So there's quite a bit of movement, and that makes forecasting also quite difficult. So obviously if you have a population that is largely based on births and deaths, it's a lot easier to forecast. Wellington would be one of the harder regions to do, simply because we do have that churn of people in terms of inwards and outwards. But we're comfortable with that 50 to 80,000. It is backed up with good data, and it is, it's small increases on an annual basis that lead to those numbers.
Tim, online.
Oh, thank you. Just a question really about, I can see that you've got forecasts of the number of people in Wellington, and you've got forecasts of the number of households, but would it be relevant, would it not be relevant to have also forecasts of the number of jobs and also the number of the sort of average level of temporary visitors? And I was just thinking about the job one in particular, because over the last 10 years, there's been about a 40,000 increase in the number of jobs in Wellington. But of those 40,000 jobs, 25,000 of them have been filled by people who don't live in Wellington. So there's clearly there's a lot of people who are commuting in. There's something in the vicinity of 60,000 a day now, or 65,000 a day. Shouldn't those be part of our forecasts?
It's a very good question, Tim. I guess what we're showing you today is some of the initial assumptions that we're working on. There's still some more to come, and so at the moment we've got some work in with Infometrics, who are doing some economic forecasting to support the long-term plan, and so we will get that kind of data. I think it's due in about 6 weeks' time, 4 to 6 weeks' time, and so we'll feed that into the machine and we can brief you on those when we get that data set made available to us. But you're right, that should be part of it.
Thanks.
Ray.
Thanks very much for all this great information. I'm actually finding, when I'm talking to people, that there seems to be a change in how people live and what they're doing. And it seems like there's a lot of people I'm talking to in the northern suburbs are actually looking at, or have already moved up the coast, up the Kapiti Coast or over the Wairarapa, but they do maintain a place in Wellington. And so what they do is they come into work, and this is all because of the change in work habits about working from home and only coming into town for a few days. So it seems to me that they're doubling up on accommodation because they've got a place in Wellington now, and that may indicate why we're getting more of a demand, or why you're getting more of a prediction for single bedroom place or one bedroom places, because they're having their 3 bedroom or 4 bedroom up in the Kapiti or in the Wairarapa. So How do you factor these things in? Because it seems like if 5 to 10% of people that I'm talking to are saying that this is what they're doing, are you factoring these things in as well?
Yes, but that is harder. So the people living alone is a function of a fairly well-established pattern in the way that people live when they are 75 and their partner passed away, right? In general, and that we've got good data on. We don't have good data on how people own homes and when they're vacant and so forth. The best we get is when census is done, and we're now a very long way away from the last census. Hopefully the new census will be out in about 12 months' time for us to actually look at, and that's when we have an opportunity to interrogate what's happening in terms of the weekender and so on. Certainly it is true that we spend a lot of time when working through the housing demand level projections for the region at a SA2 level, picking apart those places like people have a home in Otaki. It's shown that it's not actually occupied most of the time. How do we treat that? Is it a weekender, or is it some form of holiday home that could flip to be have a permanent resident in it? So we do have to work through and make informed assumptions about how these patterns of partly used at the Airbnb, how they happen. They are more of a feature and an issue for places like the Wairarapa than they are for Wellington City. But as I say, for right now, I can't see the sorts of things you're saying and that you're mentioning in the data because there isn't any. So we'll be looking really hard at the census when it comes out.
Okay, great. That's good. Thank you.
That's so interesting. I could start on ghost house theory, etc. But anyway, Tony.
Yes. Thank you for this information. One quick question: could these figures by ward could they be also put in percentages? Because not sure how many there are. Not sure what the impact is in a relative sense. But it's very interesting. Second question is, what is the highest growth in the region? What area is the highest growth area in the whole region? Kapiti, we talked a lot about people going to live in.
I can, if you like percentage changes, Carterton is being one of the fastest growing places in New Zealand in the last decade or so.
Yeah.
It's an incomplete answer because it's very small, so it doesn't take very many people to make it look like the fastest growing. Kapiti has been in the top sort of 10, in and out of the top 10 fastest growing places in New Zealand for probably, on average, the last, actually I think it's in the last 100 years. So Kapiti's perennially fast grower. Once you get out into Horowhenua, slightly outside the region, Horowhenua has been remarkably fast growing over the last 10 years. Prior to that, it was very much in the doldrums. But yeah, I mean, in summary, Kapiti's the one that kind of consistently keeps
and they're above us.
Above 1%.
Yeah.
Wellington City is quite up and down, has a lot more fluctuation for the reasons that Baz was mentioning in terms of the churn in the population and reliance on international movement, whereas the progression is come to Wellington City, maybe out into the Hato Porirua, and then eventually into Kapiti. So when the regions is growing, it's sort of drifting towards Kapiti in the way that Auckland drifts to Tauranga. It's got those kind of centres of gravity. Once people stick, they tend to start going north.
Yeah, and the last question is probably as much to officers as yourselves, and that's really just around this Let's Get Wellington Moving corridor. I guess, we can have, it's very interesting and very challenging, great opportunity, but if there's a modelling being done, can we just get an update when we might be able to see indicatively where that will be, so we can look at that option from a long-term plan perspective. Is that far away?
Yes. Well, it's far away. No is the answer. It's not far away because it's we've provided the number for the future development strategy, which is that regional one we're doing. I think the Deputy Mayor was with me in Lower Hutt yesterday, and that's going to consultation by the end of the year with hearings by the subcommittee in the new year. I think the figure that we have given them is 19,000, which is, kind of the mid-range scenario.
19,000 people or households?
Households, sorry, Tony. Thanks. But just to take you back quickly on the growth question, of course, we are part of several Tier 1 councils, so under the RMA, you'd acknowledge this, the NPSUD kicks in when we have, I think it's over 1%, isn't it, per annum for most of the Tier 1 councils, and that's Porirua, Hutt City, WCC, and Kapiti. So there's a cluster of high growth councils in the planning sense within the Wellington region. That's just important to note. It's not an LGA thing, but it's relevant in terms of how the government view us centrally, central government view us in terms of growth. So yeah, FDS is in draft and it will be released very shortly, and that'll be available to the public and yourselves.
Okay, thank you.
I think we've run out of questions on population, so we can move on.
Andrea, next on financial assumption.
So, look, I've only got 3 slides, and the 3 I's. Interest, inflation, and insurance. So,
there's no I in team though.
No. So true. Look, what I'm wanting to do is just give an overview of how we incorporate these assumptions into our planning processes, because we do them at a different phase. While population is used to build up much of the forecasts that we're preparing and the forecasting assumptions, in regards to some of these assumptions, these get added on at a later point in time as we sort of do the more corporate based pulling this all together. So I just want to make you aware of that. So what we've got here is some early basis. Councillor Brown we've been emailing just now as he's online. And he's already questioned some of the interest rate information here, and absolutely right to do so, because what we'll continue to do is we'll revise this basically up until we get the final numbers. But we're just trying to basically demonstrate here how the information that we use to consider at the moment. And to get your feedback on that. So one of the points that Councillor Brown, and I'm speaking on his behalf, has said is, are we being a bit too conservative here? And that could be the case. So we'll just go away and challenge that and think about that ourselves. So in regards to the interest rates, we are certainly looking at a trend where we'll keep the current kind of higher levels of interest rates in the initial period. Then we do expect to see things kind of flatten back to the long run averages over time. Now that's certainly what we're predicting and what advice we're getting at the moment. And of course you heard from LGFA a week or two ago around some of their things, their processes. We certainly do have interest rate hedges in place, so we do manage our risk around that, so it locks those rates in. And of course the other benefit with the Local Government Funding Agency is we can borrow for a much longer term than we can through other banks, and so we get the benefit of interest rates for a long, lower interest rates if we lock them in for a lower period of time. So look, the process here when we look at the interest rates is after we do all of our forecasting of all the projects that you would like to see in our long-term plan, we look at the debt profile, and then of course we calculate the interest on top of that, and be very clear on the assumptions that we've used. And we'll be touching base also with what other councils are doing closer to the time as well, recognising that our credit rating is higher actually than most other councils. Going on to the next slide, inflation. So one of the things that the sector does in support of the long-term plan preparation and the annual plan preparation is Taitora. So they were previously known as SOLGIM, the Society of Local Government Managers, but Taitora, Local Government Professionals Aotearoa, they commission inflation information by Burl. In advance of annual plans and long-term plans. So we're waiting for that information to come through. That's provided to all councils, and all councils tend to use that information. So most of the information you will see through the long-term plan process will be exclusive of inflation. We'll apply the inflation adjusters after, as we develop the financial forecasts. and then you'll receive that as your total package as a whole. So that's the process that we go through. We're expecting that information from Burrell around October is generally the timeframes that they give that to us, but we're working on the previous October set of information at the moment. And lastly, insurance. So we're going to have a few more conversations with you about insurance. Oh, too far. You can't hurry me up. We're going to keep having a conversation with you about insurance because actually the insurance, I was going to say problem, and it's a challenge, as a really critical component of our financial strategy and the conversation we want to have with you regarding our financial strategy. So we are seeing the insurance market really constrict based on things that are coming out of GNS and the likelihood of an earthquake and the earthquake risk here in Wellington. As a result, our ability to insure and for the same values that we've been able to get is much tighter. And in fact, we can't always insure all our assets. So we need to think at alternative ways to manage that risk. Part of that is to ensure that we've got headroom in our debt capacity, but we also know that we need to think beyond those kind of traditional ways of managing insurance, because, what's that definition of insanity? If you do the same things over and over again. We need to look at something new and different. And so some of you would have heard about the insurance roadmap, and that's the work that we're doing to think about those new and different ways of thinking about this problem. It's not just a problem for Wellington City Council, it's certainly a problem right across all local authorities and actually many other organisations. But we'll continue to have those conversations with you on the insurance space as part of the financial strategy work. Happy to take any questions.
I think you got a fourth eye in there, which was insanity.
Insanity, yeah. I noticed my southern roots were coming out, I was rolling my R's quite considerably. So that's my tiredness.
Okay, Ray?
Thanks very much, Andrea. When you're looking at insurance and how much to insure, do you consider, or have you looked at what our past record is like? Like, how often do we actually need to claim on anything?
Yeah.
And is it only insured against major calamities like a big earthquake, or is it against little things like, well, whatever little thing is, a car driving into a lamppost or something?
Yeah, so look, I don't know our past history, and Sarah's had to leave, unfortunately, but certainly the wand down at the, well, we've had to have a few insurance claims for that in terms of people jumping on it. There are your general suite of individual, smaller claims. We've had a few big ones that I'm aware of around slips and other remedial, but I'm not aware of anything large in the recent past, but please don't quote me on that because my relative newness as well. But we do need to be very well prepared if there was a major event, and particularly looking at examples from likes of Christchurch. And we certainly don't know how the Auckland, Hawke's Bay, Bay of Plenty, Northland scenarios are going to play out as well, and that will have an impact on the pressure on our insurance as well.
Great, thank you.
Iona.
Thanks. I think it's good to be optimistic, but I found your use of the word challenge to be interesting. I would have thought insurance was really one of the biggest challenges of the 21st century, right? And so, and look, it's right for a completely rethink. What do you think's happening internationally? Because climate change is going to wipe the industry out, right? So it can't afford to pay for everything.
Look, I don't have a crystal ball, but we are certainly keeping abreast of things that are happening internationally. And of course, we use Aon as our brokers so that we've got that, that experience and that exposure worldwide, so we can actually follow what's happening. Certainly, they're supporting us with our work on our insurance roadmap to actually help challenge and think about things quite differently. And we've been looking and talking to other people that are looking at solutions and, within the industry and outside it and what they're doing in that space. But we'll come back with some ideas as part of the financial strategy work that we're doing as well. Or we're certainly not going to be able to fix it immediately, but where do we want to head and what are the kind of things that we can do and put in place? Yeah.
I just remembered with horror that I forgot to say at the beginning of the session we were being live streamed, but we've all been so nice that it's not problematic that I forgot. Did Ben?
Yeah, are there any assets, I suppose, coming out of the community facilities review, if it's a hall that's used twice a month, that we might just make a call to go, you know what, this isn't worth having into the asset register, and if it burns down, it burns down.
Yes, absolutely. So we do work like that periodically to look at our assets. So a really good example of that, as we've just been looking at some of our waterfront, and really looking at with the future work program ahead of us, and work that's going on there, what assets need to be insured or what don't, and so having a really good, robust conversation about those kind of things. So that's the kind of work that we do on a regular basis.
Out of curiosity as well, do you know the last time we did a tender with our insurance program?
No, I don't actually. I can come back to you with that.
Thank you.
All right, we've run out of questions again. Next player. Alison's the next player.
Microphone on. Right, so this part of the presentation, we're talking to you about where climate change turns up in the assumptions part of the LTP, but also where else climate change, the financial impacts of climate change might show up across the LTP as a whole. So as a reminder, we have, as a council, a strong commitment to climate action that came through in the LTP draft priorities and outcomes piece of work that you've seen recently. And of course, we have a declared climate and ecological emergency, Te Atakura, as our strategy. So that's kind of everything that we're doing at a strategic level. As an organisation, regardless of whether we had those strategic positions, all organisations are impacted by climate change and have financial impacts of climate change upon them that need to be reflected in their forward budgets. Recently, the XRB has released a climate reporting disclosure standard that applies to all listed companies. It also applies to the local government financing authorities, so where we get debt from. Is subject to this piece of reporting legislation. And so they are interested in knowing from us, how is climate change going to impact us financially as an organisation and therefore impact their debt book? So they're thinking about this for all councils. How do they collect this information? How do they encourage councils to have this kind of thinking go on in their budgeting? So this is the process that we've started running ourselves. We are using this standard to assess the financial implications of climate change on our operations. So how does extreme weather events affect our ability to maintain the roading network? How does climate change impact the cost of insurance? So how do these kind of cost pressures flow through? And that's kind of almost separate to any additional financial costs that we put into the LTP as part of our commitment to Te Atakura to take action on climate change. So if that makes sense. Clear as mud. So in the 2021 long-term plan, we talked about two types of assumptions. We had assumptions about the forward price of carbon in the ETS because we pay carbon liability at the landfill that we recover through charges at the landfill. So we needed to understand how the price of the ETS might impact that. And we also looked a little bit at the impact of physical risk upon us as an organisation. The process that we're running for this LTP is more in depth, And it's using this CRD standard, which is based on the wordily named Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures Framework. There's nothing we like more in the sustainability world than a good acronym, so my apologies for that. I've tried to remember to step them all out. So this is a more sophisticated approach to planning for uncertainty. So rather than assuming a single future state, which is normally what we do for assumptions in the LTP, this type of analysis uses a range of potential future climate scenarios to try to understand the impacts. So it's a bit of playing what if. The analysis is mostly qualitative, although we have captured some of the risks quantitatively through some of the asset management plans. But it's fair to say that we're on a journey with doing this kind of assessment. So where those impacts are near-term and quantifiable, we are increasingly including them in the actual calculations for our finances. And we are using this process to qualitatively assess the potential scale of the financial impact that might not be included in the detailed financial modelling that we need to allow debt headroom for in our debt to revenue ratio, or that we need to make assumptions about. So over time, we want to get more certainty and be able to incorporate this into the LTP in a more granular level. Some of the financial implications are either further out or not knowable. So they're going to stay as assumptions. So the process that we follow, I thought it'd be helpful to unpack a bit what I mean by a TCFD, CRD, XRB process. All of the alphabet. I once gave a speech doing the alphabet soup of sustainability, but that's an aside. So scenarios are based on both physical risk and transition risks. So physical risks are what happens when the world heats up and there's more extreme weather, and how will that impact you? So that's very tangible, and we've seen that with the floods, with Cyclone Gabriel. Those are very easy to touch and understand. Transition risks, though, are also something that TCFD asks you to think about. So that's saying if we were to reach a 1.5 degree world, that would mean that locally and globally, a lot of policy positions would be put in, consumer expectations would be different, the price of the ETS would be a lot higher. So there's a world of differences in that future world that could impact us financially. So for example, in the finance sector, the way LGFA is impacted is the people that they go and buy debt from have higher expectations of them as an organisation around sustainability. That's a transition risk. So we are assessing both of those. The scenarios normally get put into 3 buckets. One is we manage to hit a 1.5 degree world in an orderly fashion. There's nice, orderly regulations and clear policy signals globally, locally. All businesses are merrily chomping the elephant into nice little bite-sized chunks, and we're all doing it in order in the most economically efficient way, with lots of policy certainty, and everybody's holding hands, right, as we go through this path. That's where you've got policy settings introduced early, they're stable, it's predictable. Disorderly is where we do still get a 1.5 degree world, but it's done late and a bit chaotically. So everyone kind of freaks out and slams through some policy, and the impacts are kind of less predictable and more kind of, bumbling along, and then bam, a new piece of regulation. That's a disorderly transition. Under both of those transitions, the 1.5 degree world has some level of physical impact, slightly more than what we have now, which is a 1.1, 1.2 degree world. But it's not the level of physical impact that a hothouse world has, which is a 4 degree warmer world, where the level of severity in extreme weather events is a lot higher. Too little action has been taken too late, and those physical impacts are a lot stronger. There's also a possibility, particularly in New Zealand, where we do a lot nationally to try and maintain a 1.5 degree world, but we still end up in a 4 degree world. So there's also the possibility that you face both transition risks from New Zealand central government, communities, businesses all wanting to transition, and we still get the hothouse 4-degree weather events. So there's the possibility that both of those things happen. I really hope that's not the future we end up in, because that's the most expensive version. But it is still a possibility that we need to make mental headspace for. This is kind of another slide trying to unpack the same concepts that I was talking about. It's just to give you reassurance that yes, we're using experts, and there's a lot of like detailed modelling, lots of models from NIWA, from the IPCC. I won't bore you with all of these, but just it's grounded in a fair chunk of evidence science and modelling. These are some examples of physical risks that might impact us. We're in the middle of this assessment. We haven't had the final list of risks and opportunities given to us by the people that we're using to help us with this process, but here's some examples of what might happen for us. So the potential financial impacts of extreme weather, for example, is increased investment in asset upgrades or increased disruption to our operations. So can we deliver a minimum level of our basic services? You know, what does it mean to do curbside pickups in a city that has more extreme weather events, and does that get more costly, or do we have to change kind of how we design and deliver those sorts of services? Transition risks and opportunities, these are some examples, but increased costs for labour, increased costs for insurance, there's reputational risk, potential litigation, so those are kind of all of the risks that you can get in a transition world. Keep in mind that this framework was designed to try to make sure that investors put their money in the right places. So it's a useful framework for anyone, but it is designed, it's squarely aimed at the oil and gas industry. That's who they hope will apply this framework, and that investors will realise that those assets are stranded and put their money in something else. So just keep that in mind when you look at transition risk, because I don't think we would get sued, but an oil and gas company could get sued. So that's why reputation and legal risk is on here. So it's just a bit of context as to why this framework is in existence. So this is a very busy diagram I put together trying to unpack for you how costs from climate change might be spread across different areas of the LTP and where you might see it turn up. So obviously there's right at the very top, maintaining current infrastructure level of service. Maintaining our current level of service across the roading network, for example, will get more expensive as we have more extreme weather events. That is not counting our desire to increase the resilience of the transport network to extreme weather events, or our ability to use the transport network as part of our resilience system. So you get kind of cost from increasing resilience, but also cost in just extra repair work that you would have to do when there's more extreme weather. There's also infrastructure investments that you make as part of your response to the transition risk. So investment in infrastructure to reduce emissions, because that's what community expectations are of you, that's how you would invest money. So that's just a few examples of how it could turn up. Anything else I wanted to say about that? In terms of our mainstreaming of this work into the LTP, we're definitely on a journey. So we are maturing in our approach of incorporating climate change into our infrastructure planning. That's kind of, I would say we're doing some of that work for this LTP, and for the next LTP we'll be in a much better place. But you've had presentations on the uplift that we're going through in our understanding of our asset condition, for example. When we have that better data, then we will also be able to have a better picture of how climate change might impact those assets over time. So it's a journey that we're on. We're also maturing in our approach to adaptation as a council, as you know from the workshops that we've had on that topic, and we haven't yet completed this TCFD analysis. So we're on a journey, we're making good inroads, and there will be good content in this LTP that will satisfy our auditors, in my opinion. That was it.
Iona.
Thanks. Look, it's great that we have started on this. I guess the question is, though, is some of us a bit late, given that climate change is right here, right now, and doing some damage? So some of these things, the damage has already been done, some of the bad choices have already been made that will be trickier to shift.
Well, this is about understanding the impacts and incorporating them into the budget. So it's a separate conversation what level of climate change response the council wants to have or how much it wants to invest. That's a level of service conversation. This is more about understanding how climate change is going to turn up in the budgets and over what time period.
And that was my second question, because given climate change impacts absolutely everything, there is nothing that it can't touch. I guess I was just wondering about the scope of that. So, for example, if businesses find it difficult to get materials, that puts them under pressure, they can't pay the rates. Is that the kind of thing that will be looked at?
We may look at that under transition risks in terms of does climate change impact our rate space? So over time, would the impact of climate change on the people who pay rates to council have a negative impact on their ability to pay rates? So that is a transition risk to local government, yes.
Okay, and those on low incomes who've got vulnerabilities presumably would be in that too?
That's all things to be considered in the analysis.
And just last question, you seem very calm. I presume you think there is some urgency that I'm just worried that we still keep talking about 2050 targets. You know, they need to be achieved as soon as possible.
Well, we do have a City 2030 target. It was on one of those slides. I do appear calm on the outside, Iona, because otherwise I'd be rocking in a corner in a fetal position. So it's important to maintain a certain level of emotional regulation as you face a climate change emergency, or I couldn't get out of bed and do my job. So
okay, all right, good answer, Alison.
Don't
Thank
mistake
you.
the calmness for a lack of understanding of the urgency of the
Good
challenge.
life advice, Alison. Right.
Thank you very much for that. Has there been any consideration for a managed retreat situation where we look at our coastal communities, and if we have a sea level rise and those properties become untenable, is there any liability on the council for those, or we just give them a canoe and or what do we do? Like, are we building anything into our long-term plan for this situation?
There is no current certainty as to who pays for the impacts of climate change, like you mentioned, the impacts that fall on private property. So the government has yet to release their policy on the Climate Change Adaptation Act, where we are expected that they will release something about funding and financing and regulatory mechanisms that will assist local government to respond to that. At the moment, local government has no legislative responsibility for the impacts of climate change on private property. So this analysis and the impact of climate change into our long-term plan only looks at the impact upon our ability to deliver services to the city, not the financial impact that might be incurred by the city in terms of impacts on private property. So yes, that's important. No, it's not part of this analysis.
Well, you're right about the fetal position. But I actually wonder, do we have any way of measuring whether we're really investing in the right things? Because, you know, we're spending lots and lots of money on some very expensive projects. How do we really assess with a climate change lens whether that's going to deliver? Would we be better to actually do lots of little improvements and around the city, rather than a great big bang project like Let's Get Wellington Moving? And
it's important to note that for Let's Get Wellington Moving, it is a project that creates urban density and development, and is a way of making sure that the growth that we're expecting in the city is around transport corridors and isn't in greenfields. So it attracts the population growth centred around a zero carbon transport system. But the one of the reasons why we're doing Let's Get Wellington Moving, I mean, the key motivation for it is housing affordability and accessibility. We want more houses because more houses means it's more possible to live here and that the prices are more affordable. That's the goal, that's the key reason why we want to do it. It's about urban regeneration and urban development more than it is about climate. It's so I would just kind of... It's not fair to say that Let's Get Wellington Moving is a project that we would solely do for a climate perspective. It's not a climate change project, it's an urban regeneration, urban development project that also creates the city that we want, that is a lower carbon city. Does that kind of make sense? In terms of your question around impact and measurement, that is something that my team is working on. It's very hard to link a particular investment to a particular outcome. But when you look at other cities around the world who have put together climate action plans and you look at the advice that comes out of the international bodies and out of C40, which is the advice for cities, we are doing all of the things that they would recommend as the most high impact activities to do, and that they have analysed will have the biggest impact for us, for our city. And that's something that we regularly kind of check back in on and verify, if that makes sense. So, in other words, I feel confident that what's in Te Atakura and that what we're pursuing as a climate action response is impactful and meaningful.
Right, thank you.
Thanks, Alison, for freaking us out. And Siobhan.
Talking about water reform, but I'll try. Okay. Right, so just a recap of the current government direction on water reform. So we've got 3 bills that are on track to pass into law by the end of this month, and we've taken you through each of those bills over the last little while. The water regulation is going to continue via Te Mata Arawai. And there's going to be the economic efficiency and consumer protection, which will be our economic regulation, which they're targeting to be established between July 24 and July 26, although I would have to say that's quite an ambitious timeline for establishing economic regulation. So I'll talk about the changes. You know, we're now in Entity G, not Entity C, so there are now going to be 10 entities, not 4, which was the original design. And we are aiming for Entity G to have that be established by 1 October 2024. So there's general agreement, not unanimous agreement, across the councils that make up Entity G to go as soon as possible, and it looks like October 2024 would be the soonest we could go. I'll talk about the change in government in another slide, because that's quite significant. So, intent to pass legislation by August. 10 entities go down to 4. There's going to be regional representation group made up of iwi and elected members, and there's going to be a staggered approach. So we've been working really hard with the NTU to make sure we kind of secure an early spot for transition as possible. So Entity G is just the Wellington Water Councils, so it doesn't include regional council. So there's the 5 Wellington Water Councils, plus Carterton, Marston and Kapiti. I've got 2 things on the go here, maybe I'll close that. So DIA's given us some pretty good direction in terms of what we've got to include in our long-term plan on the assumption that water reform goes ahead. So we have to at least maintain existing levels of service, and we've got to include it for the first 2 years in terms of CapEx for the activities. We've got to state what the intended levels of service provision will be, provide the funding impact statement, provide forecast financial statements and funding impact statements. So we're not required to provide that for the 25-26 year if the responsibilities are transferred before 1 July 2025, which under the current plan we will be. So our working assumption here is that Wellington City Council will be left no worse off. That was the commitment provided by government when they introduced this reform program. So it has no impact on affordability of other council services and leaves our debt revenue ratio intact, essentially. Things we don't have to do. So we don't have to amend an adopted long-term plan when we lose those assets in 2024. We don't have to include the DIA non-financial performance measures, and we don't have to include information on water services as part of our infrastructure strategies. And we don't have to estimate the effects of any uncertainty relating to water service reforms, which is odd, because there's so much uncertainty. So things to do with managing uncertainty. We are working really closely with DIA, with the entity G Establishment Group, with the NTU, and making sure that we've got direct correlation between the long-term plan and the asset management plans. We've also, Andrew's done a fantastic piece of work working with the other CFOs and the Wellington Water Councils to define what we need in terms of a minimal viable product to lead and to include in our LTP. So for those of you who are here at the last LTP, you'll recall Wellington Water provided envelopes of service levels, if you like. And it was very difficult to discern how they were built up. So we really want, this MVP is about building up a bottom-up asset risk-based asset management plan, essentially. So determining what needs to be done and why, and what the risk of not doing things would be. So we've had really a lot of encouragement from Wellington Water in terms of what they've done in their wastewater treatment plants. They've got some really good asset management plans around wastewater treatment plant. What we're seeing there is that there's a lot of investment required to bring those up to scratch. And we're kind of looking at that for all of the other asset types as well. So we're working really closely with Wellington Water and with the other councils on delivering that MVP. So here we go, get to the good bits. So there is quite a lot of uncertainty about this, and the key uncertainty is obviously due to a potential change in government. And National has indicated and been quite consistent in its indication that it will repeal the water reform legislation within 100 days, so that's approximately by the end of Feb next year, which is kind of the time at which we'll have our LTP landed. It's stating that it's not going to require entities to be established and has said, well, we'll just leave it up to councils. We've heard councils what they want. We're going to leave it up to them. And they can establish CCOs if they want to. They haven't been particularly forthcoming in terms of how water will then be funded. So obviously if we have a CCO arrangement, the assets will still be on our balance sheet. We'll still have all of those challenges with depreciation and funding, etc. They have said funding may be made available for financially sustainable models, but again, it's not clear what constitutes a financially sustainable model. But they will continue with economic regulation. So these implications, obviously, they're kept on our balance sheet, along with all the funding and depreciation risks that come along with that. And for the time being, the asset management and service delivery will remain with council or with the CCO as we've currently got. So I'll take questions on water, then I'll move on to Let's Get Welly Moving, if you like.
I just wanted to note for councillors that as the long-term plan working group that met, and Councillor Brown is online, but he sort of suggested that we start doing some thinking about what our ask would be of a new government about what what the model that we would want is under their kind of so that work is progressing. Yep. So I'm speaking for you, Tim, but you're there. I haven't seen any questions, so let's do. Oh, Loza.
Just to clarify how this will work, like obviously. In terms of budgeting for the LTP, so obviously we still need a lot of work to be done. So we will carry on putting a budget in for that work,
yep.
and then we will carry on. So it's just what happens when things are starting to to break, and they need, we're still needing a lot of investment. So do we still assume that we will be needing to invest in that? Baz knows that I've just been talking about Houghton Bay is a really big problem. So I guess it's that uncertainty. How do we go forward knowing that that needs to be fixed?
Yeah, so I think that's why we're really encouraging this MVP, so this asset management approach, so that we can actually do those trade-offs, so we can actually have a look and say, and even under the current regime, which would see us transitioning within 18 months of the LTP, at least we would have a forward view, and we've asked it to be a 10-year forward view of actually what work would need to be done, and if it's done on a risk basis, then you have some ability to prioritise where the expenditure goes, at least for the first 18 months, and then if there's a change in government, that may continue.
I think that's a really important point that one of the principles that we've established as part of the MVP working group is that actually the residents of Wellington or the respective councils that are represented around the table still want to rely on the fact that water services will be delivered. So we're planning for a full 10 years. And if we're not using the information in our LTP, it will go into the asset management planning of the new entity. So we're really kind of being entity agnostic to a certain extent and thinking about this from a service and a people lens. So that's the approach we're taking. Does that make sense?
Carry on. Thank you.
Keep calm and carry on.
Keep calm and carry on.
Now, I have got another couple of questions on this now. I'm conscious that we were supposed to finish at 3. If we go a little bit over, is that okay with people? Okay. Well, because so I'll take the 2 questions that I've got. Sarah.
Yeah, I'll keep it really quick. We've just received the finding, and through the new mechanism for the sludge treatment plant. What happens with that if the reforms go ahead as they currently?
So the levy will continue regardless. So the levy is a standalone payment that just continues. So ratepayers will continue to pay that levy
to us.
Yes, but the plant will transition to the new entity.
Okay. What about the debt?
Well, the debt is wound up in the IFF.
Yeah, there is no debt.
All right. Okay.
Iona.
Very quickly too. So the asset management planning will be a rigorous exercise.
It will be more rigorous than it was last time.
Okay, and it's not entirely reassuring. And the other thing is just the envelope thing. I just really need to hear the advice about what is needed, and then we will prioritise, not what they think we've got money to spend. Thank you.
Let's get Wellington moving.
Okay. So I don't think this will take too long. So as you know, 3 components, well, effectively 2 components of Let's Get Wellington Moving. You've got the transitional program, which is made up of city streets, and the 3-year program, and then the transformational program, which is the big investment, which includes the MRT. So at the time of preparing the LTP, we'll know the construction costs and timings for the 3-year program, and we'll have a good idea of the city streets as well. For the transformational program, that detailed business case isn't due to be complete until the end of next year, so we won't have, we'll still have uncertainty around the shape and the cost and the funding of the transformational program. So we have to make some assumptions about funding. So we need to make assumptions about the cost of the transformational program. So we will be using the costs that were in the indicative business case. We'll have to make assumptions about the expected contribution we will make to the transformational program, so what's our local share, and the funding mechanism that we'll need to make to finance its shares, and how funding for that transformational program will be repaid. So at the moment, we know we don't have or won't have debt headroom to contribute to the transformational program, so we're going to need to make an assumption about how we fund our portion. And then depending on the funding solution, we're going to need to consider how it's going to be repaid. For example, will it be rates, through levy, through congestion charging, etc. And again, much like water, big uncertainty here in terms of the general election and what will happen to the Let's Get Wellington Moving programme, with the National Party policy being not to continue with it in its current state of governance and the funding structure. So we'll need to revisit those assumptions in October. I think that's it. Is that me?
Interesting why you just attach this to the national government, because what we're hearing also is the potential of changes from the Labour government, and also with the revised GPS statement coming out on Thursday. So just wondering how, there might be more information by the end of this week on that. So how you will factor that in as well, and also the impacts of the GPS statement on other transport projects that might be in train for this organisation.
Yeah, so until we see that, we won't know how to factor in, but obviously we'll need to take that into account when it comes out.
Thank you.
Tony.
Yes, given the uncertainty around the funding shares, is there any plan by Let's Get Wellington Moving or any of the partners to get some certainty to this before we have to put our long-term plan to the public in terms of agreeing a funding share?
I can answer that. So there has been a group that has just been established, and we met for the first time on Friday to start working through some of those core challenges, particularly with the with Waka Kotahi, Greater Wellington and ourselves, and just making sure that we're working through that and what the possible scenarios or options could be.
So as one of the outcomes of this group, which is good to hear, and that's fantastic, actually to provide some more certainty in time that when our long-term plan goes out substantively to the public, that we have some certainty about what our share is.
So we're working in accordance with our LTP timeframes for that. With the exception, as Siobhan noted, around the cost, because we've got the IBC, we'll use the IBC. The DBC won't be developed by then, but the funding elements and the financing elements of that, there'll be some information that we work through that we can bring to say, these are some possible options.
Okay, thank you. That's good news.
Yeah, Diane, it's you.
So I know it's an indicative program, but we know the government has not got any money in future budgets for Let's Get Wellington Moving. So given they haven't got any money in budgets going forward, and I know budgets can change, is that something that you factor into the assumptions? Because obviously if we haven't got any money in our budgets, and if you want to put money in our budgets, but yet we don't have any guarantee, whoever is in government, that they're going to put money into budgets.
Yeah, so part of that working group will work through all of that. So it's Waka Kotahi, ourselves in Greater Wellington that are part of that group, recognising that at the moment the assumption is it will come from the NLTP, but we also, as you noted, the GPS comes out later in the week. That could give, I don't know what's in that, so we'll need to wait until we see that furthermore. And earlier conversations of that group involved the Treasury. So again, we work to different timeframes, central government and local government, but we just need to continue to work together on this and to look at what we can. At the moment, we've got cabinet papers that have made commitments to a level of funding for this at this point in time. Until we've got anything updated, we just need to keep working through what is the best available information we've got at any point.
So have we got any papers or information? It went from 6.4 billion to 7.4 billion. Have we got any updated figures since from that?
No, that's the information. I'm just looking at Siobhan in terms of that's the indicative business case, and so that's the information that would be used. I think the other important thing to note is that as part of this LTP, if all things are planning to go ahead as they are now, we would be looking to reconsult with the community when a detailed business case is made available. We don't necessarily want it to be the focus of this long-term plan because we're only doing it on the indicative business case. Once we've got the detailed business case, we can then go out and have a more robust conversation with the community. So that this LTP this is what is signalled, this is what we are assuming, then we would look to do a LTP amendment when we've got the detailed business case at that point in time, if that is what you want to progress with.
Okay. Do you want my opinion now?
No. We'll look forward to it later. So we've run out of questions. I'd like to thank everybody for, this has been a highly informative session and great stuff. Thank you, everyone. Kia ora.